Well, thank you, Mr. Moss, Mr. Schneider, Mr. Mavinga. Mr. Moss, if I might, you offer in some ways the most bracing and broad summary of what I think is a common theme across all 5 witnesses today, which is grave concern that should elections be held on an accelerated timeline, there is virtually no chance that they will be peaceful, free, fair, effective, respectful, respectable, certifiable. You urge that the United States become more active and creative on Zimbabwe policy, yet also recognize we have relatively limited policy tools. And I would agree with your assertion that we should not be lifting sanctions simply in response to a peaceful election, but should instead insist on the whole menu of respect for private property, for human rights, for open civil society, for free media, as well as the precondition being a free and fair election. How would you suggest we go about being more innovative, more active, more creative on Zimbabwe policy? What else would you urge on this subcommittee at least?
Thank you for the question. Look, I think it's not just a matter of engaging or not engaging, lifting sanctions or not lifting sanctions. The United States is can be a very creative and powerful actor. It can be a player if we're actively engaged, and it can be a player if there's direction given to the administration from above or from Congress to try to achieve a particular outcome. What I fear I've seen, particularly over the last 4 years, is a stepping back of the United States where they're frustrated that sanctions haven't led to the outcome that we may desire, and that our policy tools are limited. So we become passive actors, and in a sense we outsource our foreign policy to SADC or sometimes to the South Africans, which may have very different outcomes in mind. And while on paper we may share some of the very same interests, we don't always behave in the same manner. And so I believe that the U.S., through various components of the U.S. government, if it was given clear direction on what the United States was trying to achieve, could come up with much more creative strategies to try to, for instance, peel away part of ZANU-PF with which we will have to work with in the future, and try to further isolate parts of ZANU-PF with which we should not work with in the future. And I think that kind of nudge could make an important difference, not just in Zimbabwe but internationally, where we've seen a general stepping back, including among our European and other allies, which have also gotten frustrated with Zimbabwe.
And thank you, Mr. Schneider. ICG's recent report also indicates MDCT and ZANU-PF may be internally fragmented. You know, this isn't unusual for long-standing contestants, for political parties that are more created around an individual than around a policy agenda. But do you see this as a sign of the emergence of more pragmatic or reformist leaders within these groups, or is it just a sign of ongoing competition for the spoils of power?
Within some of those factions, and clearly a pragmatic effort to move forward. And I think they recognize that Zimbabwe is sort of poised on the edge of a cliff, and it's either going to go over that cliff and see further violence, further disaster, or move away from it and hopefully build a different kind of future. I will say that right now, at least within ZANU-PF, they're the minority of those who have expressed those kinds of views, but I do think we should try to find ways to work with them as well as those within MDCT that are ready to respect the Constitution, respect the rule of law, and abide by the conditions that are required in order to have a free, fair election, and then to move forward on the reforms that remain to be achieved. There are a series of reforms on removing the repressive provisions on the media law, on security, that have not taken place. Those need to take place. There needs to be far more done with respect to ending impunity for violations of the law, violations of human rights. I will say one thing. The Constitution that was adopted as a result of compromise between the two major political parties and with the support generally of civil society. That provided for the transitional election, not July 31, but within 4 months. And that, as we've heard, by the end of October. And to the degree that we can press, and that's what we should be focused on right now, how do we move all of our diplomatic resources along with SADC and the AU in trying to bring about the conditions, and particularly control over the security forces, the conditions to permit that election to take place and the transition to occur. And it's clear, election day is not the crucial issue. The crucial issue is what happens before and after. And ensuring respect for the outcome, particularly if it's an opposition outcome, is a critical part of the process.
Mr. Schneider, do you think it is still possible for there to be elections within this calendar year if pushed back by several months, if all those preconditions are met? I mean,
Yes.
the referendum that confirmed, that approved the Constitution was broadly welcomed as being a peaceful, there's high participation rate, but as you comment, it's because there was agreement between the political parties and the outcome. Mr. Moss describes the likely outcome here as I think, barely tolerated political charade if it remains on the compressed schedule, but raises some question as to whether there can be a credible election in 2013 at all. Do you think it is still possible if SADC, AU, and other players like the United States align their resources, and if wings of both key political parties embrace the possibility of a positive path forward here?
The answer is one hopes so. One cannot be confident, but I think that you have a much better chance of having that outcome if everybody is focused on those reforms and clearly sets them out as these are the red lines, these are the benchmarks. Without these, there cannot be anything that's viewed as a credible election, even if it's peaceful on election day. And we still don't see that in place, and that's what we've raised in all of our reporting.
Mr. Mavinga, if I might, across all three of you and many different sources, a key concern is security sector reform, is the politicization of the police and the military, and the sort of lack of credibility that they will remain neutral in the election. What players inside or outside of Zimbabwe, in your view, have the credibility or resolve to successfully press for security sector reform? And is security sector challenges, the ongoing politicization of the security forces, really one of leadership, or is it deeply entrenched in the security forces at all levels?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Zimbabwe, the major challenge is one of the leadership of the security forces, which is extremely partisan and highly politicized. So focus should really be on ensuring that the leadership are reined in to conduct themselves in a politically neutral way. Within Zimbabwe, President Mugabe, as the commander-in-chief of the defense forces, has that role and political power to rein the security forces in. For the U.S. government, the best will be to work through and support SADC initiatives. South Africa, as the facilitator for the negotiations in Zimbabwe, is best placed within the framework of the roadmap to elections to put forward a code of conduct for the security forces to comply with, and to ensure that there are mechanisms to enforce it. The challenge has been a failure to enforce the laws. The new constitution that was signed into law last month has a provision in Article 208 that all security forces should be non-partisan, politically neutral, and should not align themselves with any one political party. So it is just a matter of ensuring that there are mechanisms to implement this article that already is agreed to by all the political parties.
Thank you, Mr. Mavinga. Senator Flake?
Thank you. Let me follow up on a question Chairman Coons asked. Mr. Schneider, you seem to indicate that you believe that free and fair elections could be held still this year if it's put off a bit. Mr. Moss, you going to say not this year. Mr. Moss, do you want to explain why that's the case, why a couple more months wouldn't do it?
Yes, thank you. Look, I think we want to differentiate between the mechanics and the legal provisions for holding an election clearly you want to try to follow, you want to follow the letter of the law to the extent you can. You obviously want to have the ballots where they're supposed to be so that the mechanics operate as they should. And actually, USAID has an extremely long and proud history of supporting these technical preparations for elections, including in the 2008 elections in Zimbabwe. Support there was essential to getting to that first round loss for ZANU-PF and actually seeing what had happened.
Just one second. On that first round loss, then, in your feeling, was the technical aspects there? Were there sufficient ballots distributed in the rural areas? All of the technical things were there for the first election before that?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. But we want to separate the mechanics of an election from the environment for people to use that election to express their political preferences. And here we have to go back, and it's even before 2008, but certainly 2008 was a watershed area where towns, villages, regions that had voted in the first round election for the opposition provided a map for the security forces to know where to target. And they then executed this plan of intimidation to ensure that this next round and no future elections would ever be lost by the ruling party. That system, intense intimidation and organized violence, including, I have no doubt in my mind that there are contingency plans in place for armed groups to be deployed if necessary, and people know that. Once you've had your house burned down, you've had a family member disappear, maybe you've had a family member chased out of the country, and you've been told that we know how you vote, you're going to think twice before expressing your political, and they've taken your radio away, you're going to think twice about voting for who you really want to vote for. And I do not believe in that environment, even if it's technically capable, if it's technically correct, that you're going to see the true expression of the Zimbabwean people.
You've outlined in your written testimony a series of abuses that have occurred just over the past little while. Is it your feeling that that is laying the groundwork, obviously with the intimidation factor, but that they're readying a plan to make sure that they don't go through what they had to go through last time? Is that an accurate assessment?
That's very accurate. I don't think that it's an accident that the groups involved in electoral education have been specifically targeted. In my written testimony, I submitted a list from the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights and Justice, I think that fits into a larger pattern of the security forces working closely with the ruling party to ensure the electoral outcome that they desire.
Mr. Schneider, you mentioned that it would be useful if SADC forces were embedded with Zimbabwean security forces. How likely is it that ZANU-PF would allow that?
It's an interesting question. SADC has done this in other countries, and that's a kind of, when you read what they're asking for in terms of deployment with respect to security, that would be a way to carry out what they're saying needs to be done. That is, observation of the security forces by SADC monitors. And we urge that that be done and at least be proposed as a way to try and avoid the, first, reducing the politics of fear, and second, actually avoiding, hopefully, violence during the electoral and post-electoral process. Let me just say one other thing. I've always believed that the United States and others on the outside should listen very carefully to people on the inside. And so it does seem to me, when trying to reach a judgment whether or not it's worthwhile taking the risk of going forward with elections, we need to be sure that we're listening to civil society groups inside Zimbabwe, the church, and other non-governmental organizations, as well as the opposition political parties, the ones who are going to put their lives on the line to be candidates, to run for office, to campaign, to go out and vote. So we should be listening to them in coming to a judgment about whether or not we should support the process. And the other point I would make is that one of the things that does give us concern as well, which I hope would be reversed, is the government rejected the permission for the UN elections needs assessment mission to enter the country, and that UN elections is part of the technical operations that essentially say this is what you need in order to carry out the elections, this is what it costs, et cetera. And it would have, it's something that still needs to be done, and I think would give confidence to others that at least if these standards are met, at least the technical side of things would be covered. But I agree with Todd in the sense that the fundamental issue is, are there going to be pressures, political and otherwise, so that the security forces feel that they cannot do what they did in 2008?